Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class on painting the full moon in ink. I am your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and this is an ongoing class on Wednesday evenings, 3 times a month, maybe sometimes 4 times a month, depending. I've got a plan for July where we're going to have 4 classes a month, so that's why I'm throwing that in there. Anyway, and the classes are an hour and a half long each, so 90 minutes, and you can always catch the recordings on YouTube the next day after each class. And last week we did sketching the full moon in graphite. So that definitely was a lead in to tonight's class. If you're just joining us and you are struggling with drawing the moon, then you might want to refer back to last week's class, but stick with us, and you can always go back and check that one out if you have any issues. You will definitely be able to follow along, but if you're struggling, then that is there for you on YouTube. I'm just going to talk about some classes that we have coming up in June, since this is the last class for May. So next month in June, we're going to have a couple of classes on drawing eyes, and got a lovely example here to show you. So we're going to be working on looking at the planes of the face around the eye and the contour lines around the eye to sketch the eyes using chalk pastel pencils and charcoal on charcoal paper. And then the week after that, we'll be doing some expressive eyes using pen and ink, and again looking at the contours of the eyes, or the planes of the face around the eyes, and talking about expressive eyes, because that's something that, when we're first learning how to draw, we kind of focus on just the basics, but once we want to start introducing emotion into our portraits, that can be an extra challenge. And then since we've had all of these classes using ink and gouache, and we've had previously a lot of watercolor classes, I decided to do a class where we look at the differences between those three things. So the differences between watercolor, ink, and gouache, and we're going to be painting the same subject, the strawberry, 3 different ways using watercolor. Well, I'm saying them out of order. There's the watercolor, that's the gouache, and that's the ink on the end. So I might leave that out just so I can refer back to it a little bit tonight. And then since these are right in front of me, I might as well hold them up. In July, decided to continue with, since I focused on eyes for June, we're going to be looking at noses in July. So I'm actually still submitting these classes, so it's a sneak preview. Those will be up on the website for you to sign up for those in July later this week. Okay, so let me switch to my tabletop view, and we'll go over supplies for tonight's class and review a little bit what we talked about in the sketching class, and we'll get started painting this full moon in ink. All right, so don't forget to tag your work if you post it on social media from tonight's class with those hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes. You can also add hashtag Learn With Michaels. You can follow at Learn With Michaels on Instagram, and you can follow me at Adrienne Hodge Art on Instagram. And I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. And there's some of my work using calligraphy ink, mostly on my business cards, and that's what we're going to be using tonight is calligraphy ink. So I'm excited about this class. This is what we're doing tonight is very much on brand for me, because I mentioned last week how I love to draw and paint the moon, and then I use primarily calligraphy ink in my work. So we're doing something straight out of what I might do in my studio. So definitely use those hashtags and tag me at Adrian Hodge Art if you post this work, especially tonight, because it is very much my style and my sort of brand of artwork that I like to make. Okay, so we're using the Sennelier brand calligraphy ink, or that's what I'm using, and I've got the Senegal yellow and cobalt blue. Those were the two colors that I put on the supply list to make green. You can use, I'll talk about substitutes in just a second. And then I've got the Winsor & Newton calligraphy white. That's the ink that we're using. And you can use like Liquitex or that's another brand that Michaels has. You could use, honestly, you can use anything. I see Sarah is commenting she's going to use white paint instead of the white ink. That's totally fine. And you could use, whatever paints you have on hand. It's going to be similar, but it's just going to be a little different as far as the the way that the ink is going to be handled. You're going to handle paint differently than you would handle ink. So, but if you are skilled with the, let's say you're using watercolor and you feel really comfortable with watercolor, then you're just going to treat your watercolor like watercolor the whole time, even whenever I'm talking about things that are specific to ink. Okay, so let me know if you have any other questions about substitutes, but any paint you want to use is totally fine, because, this is for you. You're on your own art journey. I'm not gonna come to your art space and criticize your artwork or anything. We're here to make something together and have fun. So it's anything you do is part of that process and is great. And I'm just glad you're here. Okay, and then I've got a couple of water cups to go with the ink. You can use plastic palettes. I am going to use this ceramic dish. And I do recommend using ceramic dishes for ink if you, have some that you don't mind designating as ink dishes. Like I have some, thrift store little dishes that I sometimes use, which are not on my desk at the moment, but those of you who come to a lot of classes has maybe seen me use those before with ink. Okay, and then for paintbrushes, we really just need, this is my trifecta. Those of you who come to all the classes have heard me say this a lot. I have specific paintbrushes on the supply list, but if you don't have those exact paintbrushes, you're really just going to want a flat brush, a medium round brush, and a liner brush. And those are my preferences. Those are the paintbrushes that I tend to rely on the most. You may find that you prefer different paintbrushes. You use what paintbrushes suit you best and that you are comfortable with, and whatever you have is what you have. Okay, so we've got palettes, we've got water cups, we've got our paint, our ink, whatever you are using. I've got some paper towels here. Oh yeah, watercolor paper. A lot of supplies for this one. So I put the Arches Aquarelle 140 pound. See, this is 10 by 14 paper on the supply list. And then I've got some painter's tape here, some blue Artist Loft tape, I believe was what was on the supply list. And then our reference image. So we're looking at this NASA image of the moon, just like we looked at last week for the sketching the full moon class. So that same reference photo, we're not going to be using those lunar maps anymore. Those were just what we used for practice in that sketching class. And so yeah, last week we sketched the full moon in ink and in graphite. And we mainly used one pencil, this jumbo 2B pencil, because I was trying to get everybody to stay nice and soft with their lines and, focus on that really light gray that we see all over, and we left the space blank where we were gonna have the white aspects of the moon. We left it blank on the paper. So if you're using watercolor tonight, you'll just keep that same idea in mind, and you'll leave the paper blank where the white space is going on the moon. But if you're using ink with me, then we've got this white ink to add all of our white in, but we are still going to leave some areas blank as well as we're laying down the groundwork of our moon. All right, so I'm going to set this aside and go ahead and get started here. You may have noticed that I've got these margins on my paper, and I've got my moon painting kind of floating in the middle of this 10 by 14 paper. So I'm going to tape off the paper again to create a little box in the center of the page. You definitely do not have to do that. You could just tape the outer edges. In fact, I'm contemplating doing it that easy way again, just because it'll save us some time. But I did use, you could grab a ruler if you wanted to measure out margins for this. I'm going to show you how I kind of eyeballed it, because I like to just eyeball things and not worry about them being perfect. And if you look closely, this box is not 100% perfectly centered on this page, but it's close enough, and it doesn't stand out too awkwardly to me. Okay, so what I did was I've got this mat board here. So I did use my little mat board a little bit because it has these straight lines on it. So what I did was I just placed my paper in a way that it's lined up with the ruler that's on the mat board. And I realize not everybody has this luxury here. But really just what I'm doing is just eyeballing it. I mean, even with this, I didn't make it perfect. So I think I went down about 2.5 inches, and maybe, no, I didn't use a ruler. I'm like, I know I didn't use a ruler because I don't even think I put a ruler on the supply list, but now I kind of want to get a ruler and just measure it and see how big I made the box. Because I know I did it by eye. It's 8.5 by 5. So, and I did that mainly by just thinking about the paper is 10 by 14. So I went in about, I mean, it's not perfect, but I went in just under 3 inches on the sides, and then I went down about 2.5 inches on the top margins. So, but again, you can eyeball it. The easy way to do this, to just not have margins and to not have it floating in the center of the page, would be to just tape it down all the way around and we'll just fill the page. I was just trying to save on the amount of background that I would need to paint. And also sometimes my Zoom camera, can only zoom in so far, my little webcam here, and I wanted y'all to be able to see the entire work without, needing to adjust my camera. So if that's confusing to make those margins, then I think you should just take your tape and hover over the edge of the paper, half on and half off, and just tape it down all the way around on all 4 sides. And if there are any questions about that, I can demonstrate it. In fact, let me just go ahead and do that, and I'll just tape it twice. That way I will have demonstrated both of those things. So, and my paper will be nice and secure against my table here, my mat board. And the main reason to tape down the paper is to keep it from buckling. as we add a bunch of water weight to it. And it also, you know, can really elevate a work to have those clean edges when you peel the tape off later. So that's another reason. If you're working off watercolor paper that is on a block, then you maybe don't need to tape it down, and you might just want to tape it just to have the margins or to have those clean edges when you peel it off. So I'm just going all the way around and just taping it down on all four sides. That would be the easiest way to do this. And then I'm gonna eyeball it in just a second and give myself those margins. And actually taping it this way first might help you be able to visualize those margins without a ruler. Another upside. Doing it this way. That is hilarious, y'all. I thought I locked my cat in my bedroom because she was jumping on my desk, and I just realized she broke out. She came downstairs and she ate some food, and now she's sitting in the chair behind me. She's like, get it, I'll leave you alone. That is one crafty cat. I don't know how she got that door open. I guess I didn't close it all the way. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going in. I mean, I'm cheating because I have this ruler visible on my little mat board here, but I'm just going in maybe 2.5 inches. And I'm using the other tape that I put down as a way to visually measure that I've created some straight lines. Yeah, this will save us on time for me mostly because you'll have extra time, but I want to try to finish this as much as possible. It's okay if you're not finished by the end of our 90 minutes tonight, but I should definitely be able to fill this area and have a couple of different layers. Okay, and yeah, because when we work with ink, we need each layer to dry. And so if you're covering a larger area, that means you're gonna have to wait for that entire large area to dry. So one optional thing that you might grab is a hair dryer if you're impatient with letting those layers dry. What I'm gonna do to deal with that issue tonight is I'm gonna go back and forth between the moon and the background. We're going to paint the background, a first layer on the background first, and then we're going to paint, while that's drying, we're going to work on a layer of the moon. Then while that's drying, we're going to work on another layer of the background. While that's drying, we're going to work on another layer of the moon. We're going to go back and forth like that so that we can let each layer dry. Okay, so I'm gonna take something round that I can trace for my moon. You could use your tape, or if you happen to have a cup or a dish, I've got this little saucer thing right here. And with a light pencil, just gonna trace. I'm using a chalk pastel pencil because I think that will show up on the Zoom, and I happen to have it right here. But you can use your light H pencils. I forgot to mention that we would need some pencils on the supply list for sketching out our. That was one supply I forgot to grab, but I happen to have this right here. And then last week's class, I did talk about how to sketch a circle and try to make a perfect circle in a sketch. But then I also encouraged people to use something to trace the circle if they needed to. And I'm keeping that nice and light. I'm not going to darken that because we want to, be able to paint over all of this. So I really don't need my lines to show up. And that was another reason we did the sketching class first, was to have, that help in place for you if you need it with sketching. All right, so you can look at even your sketch from last week if you were in that class to see how you sketched it, and you could sketch it the same way again. Or we're gonna look at our reference image here, and I'm just gonna really quickly sketch in those main Lunar Maria and or lunar seas and the main craters that I want to emphasize in this painting. They do not have to be perfect. They don't have to look exactly like the moon. All last week's class was about embracing these just organic shapes, and mainly what I wanted to get across in last week's class was letting the making sure that you're having the shapes that you're adding, these organic shapes, are hugging the 3 dimensions or the roundness of the moon. So we talked a lot about that last week, and I also referred back to other classes on sketching contour lines and making 2-dimensional shapes look rounded and 3-dimensional. And yeah, as I'm sketching in these lunar seas or Luna Maria, I definitely am not getting them exactly like they look in the photograph. I'm just looking for the main idea of those shapes, and I'm making sure that I'm adding them in a way that they follow the curves, that they're hugging those 3 dimensions. That's the most important thing, is that we create that illusion of 3 dimensions by letting them wrap around this 3-dimensional form. And I've drawn and painted the moon so many times, and I've never had anybody come up to me and say that some of my moons look different from each other, that I've placed the craters in a slightly different place. Nobody's pulling up a map of the moon and, gatekeeping my geography of these craters and seas, and I doubt anyone will do the same to you. All right, and then this big Tycho crater, that was the one we spent a lot of time talking about in the sketching class, and we sketched a couple of different preliminary sketches of it and created more of like a symbol of it to really notice how this one sprays out, has these radiating lines go in all different directions here. And then really that's it. I mean, if you want to sketch in some other detailed stuff, just, as little marks, like to map it out for yourself so that you don't forget that particular shape, or like where the white space is going to be. All right, that is all I'm going to do. Okay, so let's start making our washes for our first layer of ink here. I want to refer back to a class from the fall of 2023, where it was one of the first, I think it was the first class where I used liquid ink with these Michael's classes, and it was this moonscape class, and Chanel has the link to that. She can drop it in the chat, and if you're watching later on YouTube, you can just search moonscape and ink, and my name, Create a Pen and Ink Moonscape, part 1 and 2. That was the title of the class. You can search to find it on YouTube. And in that class, the first class we did this, was at the bottom of the margins here of this paper. We took our black ink and we watered it down in a variety in our little plastic palette, and all the wells we added more water to the ink so that we could dilute it and create these different values. And so that is what we're going to do tonight, but we're going to do that with green. We're going to make a little value scale of green. So first we need to make green. Oh, and by the way, you can do different colors. Like if you're like, oh, I have blue and I have yellow, or if you have other colors in front of you that you'd rather use, you can make a pink moon, you could make a blue moon, purple moon, whatever you want to do. Mostly I did green because I was looking at the full moon for May, and it was in March when I planned this, and I noticed that April was the pink moon. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't do the pink moon in May if April was the pink moon, and May is the flower moon. And it also, in the Farmer's Almanac, it said it's also sometimes referred to as the frog moon because it's springtime, so everything's blooming, right? From like April showers, like all the rain that typically happens in April, and we've had a lot of rain here lately. So, you know, the frogs are out. I'm assuming that's why it's called the frog moon. So I was like, okay, flower moon, frog moon, it should be green, but you do not have to do green if you don't want to. But I'm gonna make a green here first. So I've got my yellow and my blue. And I've got my big old ceramic palette here. And I think I'm just gonna set that right under the camera for a second here. So if you're using a plastic palette, which I have tons of, but they were all dirty, so that's why I grabbed a different one. But you know, I'll just hold up this dirty one just to set some other items inside of it here. You know, you're just gonna make a green in one of them, and then we're gonna dilute it in all these others so that we have some washes of green. And I'm just gonna do that in my big ceramic palette here. So you always want to start with the lighter color first, and then add the darker color to it. Because if we started with the darker color and added the lighter color, then the darker color is going to eat the lighter color. So if we added yellow to our blue, it would probably turn a little green, but it would probably be a dark green, and we can control the type of green that we get if we just start with the yellow and then add the blue to it. So I'm gonna take my yellow over here to a separate place on my palette. And it doesn't matter which paintbrush you use. See, like when I just touched my blue with the yellow on my brush, I didn't clean my brush first. It already turned green. So it's really up to you what color you're going to use and how, you know, what kind of green you want. If you want it to be, you know, more on the yellow green side, or if you want it to be more on the dark green side, depending on how much blue and yellow you use. I'll just go ahead and make a couple of different greens here with these piles of yellow. And it would be kind of nice to have a few different greens, to have like a really darker green. So I'm going to go ahead and turn all three of these into a green. I really want mine to be more on like the Kelly green side. I think I got a little impatient with it and made it a little more pickle green last time. But I want to go for more of a like an Irish green this time, I think. Even though I just said starting with the yellow first is a good idea. Now I'm just dropping yellow into my blue. Rules are meant to be broken, y'all. Ideally, it's good to start with your lighter color. But since we're only using one color here, I think it's okay if we go a little rogue. Okay, so I've got a dark green. Really what I've done here is I've just made 3 different piles of the same green, but there's more of it. So this will be more my like dark direct color. And then, so you want to leave one of your wells just ink. We're not going to add any water to that. And then in your other wells, I want you to have, you don't have an exact formula here for how much. You just want, you know, a different amount. So a varying amount of ink, and then we're going to vary the amount of water that we're going to add to them, because we're looking for some different values. So we're looking for, you know, the direct ink, and then a little bit darker, less ink, some water, and then more and more water to water it down. And I can't recall if I put pipettes on the supply list, but having a little pipette is helpful to use to drop water in there, or you can just use your paintbrush to drop water in. Or another thing I like to do is I have little ink bottles that I just fill up with water, so I can just drop some water in here. And you might want to test these out if you're unsure. You know, if they look the same to you, you can have a separate piece of paper. In fact, let me grab a separate piece of paper and do that real quick. But when we paint little swatches of these, they're going to look so different wet versus dry. And when I've taught an in-person class on painting with ink recently, I've even pulled up that Michael's class with the moonscape that I just shared with you to show people how these particular swatches looked when they were wet. They all looked very similar, especially these darker ones looked very similar. And then when they dry, that's when you can see how light they are. Because the ink always looks lighter when it dries. So if it's the direct ink, if there's no water added to it, then it's going to remain pretty close to the way it looked when it was wet. But when you dilute it, when you add water to it, then it may still look pretty dark when we first put it on, but then it's going to dry much lighter. So let me just do a couple of little swatches on some blank paper here, and you can do the same just to see what they look like when you paint them on, because maybe you're having a hard time being able to tell the difference. So that was the direct ink right there. I'm cleaning my brush in between each of these. Yeah, you can tell that one's much thinner, but that's gonna dry and look a little different than it looks wet. And then we've also got, you know, some different ratios, or I've got some different ratios of yellow and blue here. Okay, so those are the 5 that I made. And these actually look pretty similar, so I might want to add a little bit more ink to one of them, like this one maybe. So I can get one little puddle that's a little more in between, yeah, the 2 of those. Okay, so those will be our different values that we'll use for the craters, etc., or for the Maria. Carefully set that aside without spilling all my little ink pools that I just made. Yeah, this is a small little painting that we're making here, so it's going to be very deliberate, and we're going 1 layer at a time, and we still have a solid 40 minutes here. Okay, so I'm going to take my flat brush, and I've got 1 water cup that is just water. If you already used both of your water cups, and or if you only have 1 water cup and you've already made it full of green, maybe you want to clean it out real quick and get just some water. And I'm just going to paint with just water all the way around my moon. And then once I get a layer of just water all the way around my moon and my background, I'm going to drop in one of these washes. And we're going to get a nice little flat wash to happen with our ink. We've done this before with gouache. I'm not sure if we've done this before with ink. I guess maybe we did in the moonscape a little bit. This is definitely the reason why I wanted us to tape it off and make a smaller little area here, because if we were filling this whole page, then we've got a lot larger area to cover when we do this. Okay, so now I'm taking one of those washes, and I'm just gonna drop the ink in and then just guide it around. So ink is not paint. You know, I said you can substitute it with other paint if you don't have ink. But like I said, some of the things I'm going to say about ink are not going to apply to the other paint. Ink is not paint. So if you try to, you know, paint with it like the traditional way, like I was talking to an oil painter earlier today, who was saying how she loved how she could kind of sculpt with her oil paint and fix issues that arise and, you know, go over it with lots of layers. And I was like, well, you can do that with ink. It just takes finessing, but it also, the main thing is it takes is letting it dry. And the other thing is, in order to have lots of control over it, I'm going in really thin at first. So that fat over lean rule that you might have heard people say about oil paint, it really applies to a lot of different painting mediums, and definitely with ink. So the idea is that you keep it thin, you thin it out, and then you don't go more direct with it until the last layers. So that's fat over lean, right? So the lean goes on the bottom and the fat goes on top, meaning you use it more direct and thick on top. And that really works with gouache, it works with ink, works with oil paint, works with acrylic, even watercolor, even though watercolor doesn't get super thick. So the only reason I'm like brushing over this again is because I had some streaks and I was just trying to get rid of those. But mostly I'm just guiding it around, and I'm kind of going around in a circle. Okay, now we're gonna let that dry. We're not gonna do anything to that background for a minute until it's dry. Because if I go in and try to put the next layer on right now, I'll have to work really quickly. It's gonna bleed into that. My paper's already buckling, so it's a risky move. You have to work really quick. You might not be able to control those next layers that you put on. And if you went super wet like I did, you might want to take your paper towel and like squeegee it along the tape. This tape is not perfect and water will get underneath it and you will have a little bleedy moment underneath. So I'm just kind of squeegeeing it a little bit because that wash on top of that water just got really wet in some moments. And it's okay if it seeps underneath and you have a bleedy moment. That's not the end of the world. In fact, it happened a little bit with this one. You can see where it happened along the edge in a few places. Not that noticeable. And even if it is, at the end, it'll just give it some character. Okay, so now we're gonna go thin with our darkest craters on the moon. So we're looking at, or not craters, sorry. I noticed I did that last week too. I watched the playback a little bit and I kept calling the Maria craters. I even wrote that in one of the diagrams where it was the lunar seas, but I wrote craters. You'll have to forgive me for my little brain glitchy moments. Okay, so we're looking at these darker areas first, and mainly just because none of well, they go to the edge a little bit, but for the most part, they don't touch the edge of the moon. And if we were to paint anything at the edge of the moon right now, it's going to bleed into our background. So we're being strategic not to touch wet areas with more wetness at the moment. So we're going to focus our attention on these darker craters and start to build up some washes in the darker craters, since none of that is touching the background. And then while we're doing that, our background is going to be drying. So just going to conveniently avoid wet areas while we paint here. And I'm still using my wash, and I'm just going to fill up my paintbrush with my wash of that lightest little wash there that I just used for the background. And even though this is going to end up being a dark area, I'm just filling it in lightly right now with the first layer. Because again, when I go super light, I can control what I'm doing more. And I'm kind of stippling with my brush. I've got this medium round brush. And again, I'm just guiding that washy, watery ink around. I'm not necessarily brushing over it lots of times. I'm just making little dots, and these brushes can hold a lot of water and pigment. So the brush is loaded up quite a bit. And I'm just stippling around. So like little dots or maybe scribbles, and guiding that ink into those places inside of those shapes. And I'm being careful not to go in the areas where I want to leave it more blank for the white areas. And if you accidentally do go into one of those areas, I didn't, but I'm just going to demonstrate. You could just grab your paper towel and pull some of it out a little bit, but we also have our white ink to use to cover up some moments. We might use it like whiteout if we need to. So I recently finished a drawing and painting with ink class here in Austin, Texas at the art museum where I teach in-person classes, and there was a woman in the class who asked like 3 classes in, all right, enough with the mark making, because we were focusing a lot on the drawing aspect of pen and ink. And even with the paintbrushes, I was having them practice hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling, sort of like in this example where we did the little hatching lines with the pens. I was having them do a lot of that with the paintbrushes because I was trying to get across the idea that ink is not paint, and you'll get a lot farther if you treat it more like a pen. Even though you've got a paintbrush in your hand right now, if you treat it more like you're making one mark at a time, you'll get farther with it. And she was like, okay, enough with the mark making. When are you going to teach us how to paint with it? And I had to be like, oh, that is how you paint with it. Is you do one little mark at a time. You kind of stipple or scribble or do little hatching lines in there. That is how you paint with ink. Because if you actually, if you do like the traditional, when I think paint, I think going over the same area over and over and over again. And really, like that oil painter was saying today, being able to like sculpt and edit and, really just like taking your paintbrush and just being like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, in that same area over and over and over and over and over again. And that's what a lot of people want to do with ink. And if you're doing that right now, maybe you're noticing it's getting kind of yucky. It's not doing the thing that you might envision the ink doing. I always like to talk about ink has such a great metaphor for relationships, because oftentimes in relationships, we're trying to get our partner or our kids or our friends to do certain things or behave a certain way, or, not do a certain thing. And, you just don't get very far doing that with people. You got to let people be themselves, right? And love them for who they are, and accept them. And especially with your children, it's my little parenting tip for you, having a preteen over here. You can't make people be who you want them to be. You got to let them be who they are. So with ink, you gotta let the ink be ink. It's not paint. It's not acrylic paint. It's not oil paint. It's never going to act like oil paint. So if you try to treat it like oil paint and get mad at it for not acting like oil paint, that's a losing battle, my friends. So if you're not into letting each layer dry, then maybe ink is not for you. But that's not true, because I think I've often said patience is not something, it really just takes patience. And being a patient person is not something you are or are not. It's something you practice, right? So we can all practice being a little more patient with the ink if it's not drying fast enough for you. You can also get a hair dryer, but I'm not going to do that. I think it's dry enough now that we can go ahead and start putting our background, another background layer on here. But if yours is still super wet, then I would just hang out and wait a second. Also, when I did this background for this example, I went a little fast and I did run into some issues. So I don't want to do that again. But I'm gonna go ahead and go a little thicker with my second layer now. So I'm going to use that more medium wash that I made that had a lot of ink and a lot of water, so it wasn't quite as thin. And it's going to be a little darker. And I'm going to go like hatching lines, one little stripe at a time. And then start to fill that in. And I'm going right up to the edge of my circle of my moon. And I'm not worried about those stripes here. If you've got like some stripes showing up like I do, just let them be there. Because when this dries, it's very likely that most of those streaks will go away on their own. And if they don't, we can do another layer. In fact, I'm planning on doing another layer on this background. So squeegeeing again at the edge of my tape. So my I'm probably gonna have a couple of little stripes on this layer, and that's okay. So even when I had a lot of visible streaks on that other example, I was still able to camouflage them for the most part in that last layer. So even though this is a nice little moon study here, we're learning how to paint the full moon. We're also learning how to handle the ink, how to let each layer dry. We're learning about value, light to dark of a color. So we're doing a monochromatic painting here and using one color to distinguish between these different values. We're learning about our brush stroke techniques, which are all about those mark making techniques when it comes to ink. And we're also learning about textures here because this Sennelier ink has this fun shellac base to it. And so when we use it more direct in this last layer that we're going to put on, it gets this little sheen to it. It's like nail polish, that shellac binder that the color has. So that's an interesting texture. So we're seeing the difference between treating it nice and thin and washy like this, more like watercolor, and the texture that we can get when we use it more direct. Okay, so we need that layer to dry before we do anything else. So we're gonna go back to our craters now, or our Maria, again, call them craters. Let's look at some of these lighter ones. So we focused on the darker ones, but let's get some of these lighter ones in here. Using another small brush. And one of my washes that was super thin. It's maybe a little bit different version of that green, but that's okay. That might help you distinguish between some different values to use a couple of different greens here. I'm just filling in those areas where it's a little bit of a medium value. So like up here and maybe inside of the Copernicus. That's the Copernicus crater right there. On the inside of it, how it's white in the middle, but it's lighter in the little starburst that texture that sprays out from the center there. And then there's some other medium values around really I'm passing the time, y'all. I'm letting this, letting that background dry. So I'm like, what can I do where I'm not coming up next to the other things that I need to let dry? Like, oh, I can fill in some of these medium values. All right. And then even if some of this is still a little wet, we're going to let that work to our advantage. I just loaded up my brush with that medium dark, and I'm going to go in here. I'm going to start touching some of the edges here. And even though it's still wet in some places, that's good because I want it to kind of bleed. This is where I'm really letting the ink be itself and letting it shine in its own individual way. And what it loves to do is bleed when it touches other wet areas. So where it's wet from that lighter layer we just put on a little while ago, I'm touching it, kind of stippling it in with a little bit darker layer, and I'm letting it bleed into that other layer. And it's going to create that fun moon-like texture. And we're going to do this again with the darkest value. And that's going to really create some fun contrast. I'm just bouncing around. I'm looking at my reference photo, I'm noticing the places, a lot of the outer edges of these lunar seas where if I touch it with the darker value, it's going to bleed. And if it's dry and it's not bleeding, then you can just kind of stipple it and spread it around a little bit. You might even add some water to stretch it out and make it bleed a little bit. I'm looking like the earth right now. And if there's any moments that like you accidentally don't touch and it makes a little dry spot, try to leave those alone and let those be there because those will be nice to turn into those little white craters later. You definitely want to leave some space on purpose, but we can add the white in, put those in towards the end. Right. Definitely goes fast on this small scale. I made it even smaller, I think, than the last one on purpose. Okay, so my background is not completely dry, but it's dry enough that I can do this next part that we've been holding off on. Okay, so we want to see how most of the moon is gray, right? And that's how we get that white to stand out when we're drawing and painting it, is to do that light gray all the way around. So with the graphite, we did that light gray all over the place, but then we left it blank paper where the white was. So we want to get a light wash of green in here now, but we want to leave it blank in those areas where the white is, or just blot it out with the paper towel if you accidentally go too far, or we can add the white on top of it as well. That's why we have the white ink here to help us. I'm just going to use here's my medium round again. Okay, and I'm using that lightest wash of green. And I'm just going to go ahead and go all the way around. Because now if I touch the edge, it shouldn't bleed into the background. And if it feels too dark, you can, blot into it, or you can stretch it out with some water. And go ahead and fill in that background area on the moon. Might even be kind of fun to fill it in with like you could add some white to this green, so it makes it more of like a minty white. If you feel like your wash isn't washy enough for you, I don't know, just another option. But I am going to go right up to the edge here because I want a clean, clean edge. I'm going to go ahead and touch the background with my paint, and it shouldn't bleed my background into the moon unless your background is still super wet. And if that's happening, then I would wait to do this step. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of crazy. It's going to look like aliens have invaded the moon and took spots of it out or something. All right, so ideally we're leaving some places blank, but I can also just go ahead and blot into them with my paper towel a little bit. And I'm looking at my reference photo as I do this. Oh, and then yeah, there's this one little moment in the Tycho crater where there's like that light gray ring right there. That really sells it. It really starts to make it look moon-like. And then yeah, I tried not to go into my little streaks, but again, we're gonna add our white ink to put those streaky moments that radiate out from the craters. All right, it's coming along now. Okay, I'm gonna wait to do that background layer now, because now if we did another layer on the background, what's gonna happen is it's gonna bleed into the moon because we just got the moon edge all wet. So we gotta wait for that to dry. But while we wait for that to dry, we're gonna introduce our white and start adding some of these whites, and then we can, or actually before we add the white, yeah, never mind. Like I was saying, we could go ahead and start doing our darkest layer on our lunar Maria, but then I was like, wait, no, if we do that, it's going to bleed into the background of the moon. What am I saying? In a perfect world, you would take a break right now. Like if we were all in person and time wasn't an issue, I would be like, let's all just hang out for 5 minutes and just wait for that to dry, because it is very risky to do anything to it after we just connected that transitional moment. I always joke in person classes when people have a hard time being patient. I always jokingly say, like, go back to my grade school teacher voice and say, ask me if you need something to do while you're waiting for your layers to dry. Because people are so impatient and they just go for it, even though I've been saying the whole class how we got to let each layer dry, and that goes for watercolor classes, gouache classes, all the water media classes that I teach. People have such a hard time waiting for layers to dry when it's in an in-person class, and I get it. That's why I'm like, you can walk around the room, you can go for a walk, you can go get a cup of coffee, you can get on Instagram and scroll on your phone for a few minutes. You can text a friend, you can check some emails, and like, come on, y'all, you can kill 5 or 10 minutes here. But we'll go ahead and start adding our white. So I'm just using my little pipette here, and I got some white ink going on my palette. And we'll just start to I'm going to use one of these liner brushes. And I'll load up my brush with the white. Can you tell I'm stalling? Like, even though we don't have enough time to like really take a break, I'm like drawing it out as much as I can right here. Whoops. Just dropped something. Okay, so we're gonna start with the Tico crater and these little sprayed out radiating lines. I don't think they should bleed, especially if you um blotted it with your paper towel and you left some, I mean, I left it pretty blank right there on my paper, so I should be able to just go in between it. Yeah, it's good. I don't know if yours is wet though, like I'm like, yeah, mine's good, let's go for it. But if yours is super wet and everything's bleeding together, then, just wait. And just putting in those white streaky moments. This is the funnest part. I love this part when I'm painting the moon, and especially when everything's really dry. Ideally, you would wait for this to be that background layer to be completely dry to do this, because then this white just goes on so nice and clean, and you can really just draw with it and get this fun contrast to happen. And it's really lovely. And since this white is so opaque, I'm covering up all of my little purple chalk pastel lines with it. So if you can see any of your pencil lines, we just go ahead and cover those right up. And sometimes this looks so cool doing it nice and thick like this that it's easy to like get carried away and then it like loses its, contrastiness. So try to like, get thinner and thinner with these. Was looking at how that radiates out on the Tico crater itself. It's not perfect all the way around. I kind of made mine a little too perfect, but I can always go back in and add some green in between there and make it look a little less perfect. Okay, so I'm like, y'all don't get carried away, and then I'm getting carried away with it. All right, so I'm going up here to like the Copernicus crater and do the same thing. Looking at the reference photo to see how those look as they radiate out. That you don't have to be exactly like the photo. It's okay if it's a little different. Getting the general idea and making sure that those radiate out in a way that's hugging the 3 dimensions of that spherical shape. And then, yeah, some of your background on the moon might not be dry enough yet for some of the rest of these. Like if you put the white on and it kind of just looks a little yucky, I would just pull it out and just wait, honestly. We've got enough time that this will be dry before the end of the class, so we can come back to this. But I'm just like going around and putting a few little dots. Try that out. Okay, but I don't want to go too far because we still haven't done the darkest layer of green. But I think that background, well, you know what? Let's go ahead and do the last layer on the background, and then we'll be sure that, or I can be sure that this will be dry enough to do that last layer on the Marias, the lunar seas. Okay, so in order to create this like strong contrast of the moon against this background, we need this background to be pretty dark, right? So we want a really solid dark green here. And so I've got this puddle on my palette that I didn't add any water to, but it's looking a little thin, like some of it dried up. So I'm gonna add to it, add a little bit of blue and yellow to it. Trust that that is the green that I want. Actually, let me paint a little. Okay, yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so I didn't add any water to it. It's just my green, so it's a pretty dark green here. And I'm gonna start doing this last background layer. And if it's bleeding a lot as you're putting it on, then maybe your background is too wet. So only do this part if it's, you know, dry enough to get a nice clean layer on there. And I'm just going right up to the edge of the moon. I might even paint like a little circle around the moon, just so that I can go a little quicker and not have so many stripes. I'm gonna go pretty fast. And this is where it's always a little tricky to not shave a bit of the moon off. I can't tell y'all how many times I have done this where like have to shave the moon down and then like go back and take a little bit off the other side and then the other side, and it's like the moon circumference just keeps shrinking and shrinking. So if you do what I just accidentally did where I just made a bump right there, I say just leave it alone, because trying to perfectly fix that is gonna probably create more issues than it's gonna solve. So I'm just gonna leave that there, even though I made a little wonky moment happen. And yeah, these streaks maybe are gonna bother you when it's wet, but they will not be as visible when it dries. And if they are, then you just do another layer. Okay, it's not the end of the world if you end up doing another layer. This is the problem, is people freak out when things don't work out the way they want with ink. I see it all the time since I've been teaching pen and ink classes for 10 years now. And you're like, oh my God, there's streaks. I gotta fix it. I gotta fix it. It's like, yeah, but you really don't, because it's kind of freeing if you let yourself off the hook a little bit, where it's like, okay, well, it's like when it's 10 p.m. and the work day is over and the day is over and you know, if you didn't solve a problem at work that day, what are you going to do about it now? You know, I guess not 10 p.m. That's like 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., whatever time of day when you clock out and let yourself off the hook. For me as a freelancer, it's 10 p.m. I'm like, well, that's it for me. That's the day's over. Like, just let it go. That's a tomorrow problem. So if there's a weird moment in this layer, that's a next layer problem. If you make it a this layer problem, you're probably just going to make it worse. And I say that with years of experience of painting with ink, y'all. Okay, yeah, I got a lot of streaks, but I had a lot of streaks in the last one too. And it's okay. You can even still see some of the streaks in the last one. See, they don't bother me too much. They bothered me when it was wet though. Ooh, I just tried to fix that little area right there. See, okay, that's what happens. I'm like, don't try to fix anything. And then I just tried to fix something, and what it did was it made her really, it just stands out because now that area has a big extra glob on it. And the other thing it does, actually, this is good that I just did that so you can see what happens if you're like, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? What happens is it kind of upsets the half wet layer that you just put on, and it'll like create a little bald spot right there. It'll like lift it back out. So that's the other reason. But if you wait for it to completely dry and then go back in and fix any weird moments, then it's gonna, it'll cover it up. Okay. Oh, that was stressful. As much as I tried to talk us through it, it still stressed me out. Okay, so we're gonna leave that alone and let that dry, because see, look at all those dried streaks. It's not a big deal. It'll be fine. You can always do another layer later. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and do this last layer with the direct ink on the darkest part of the Lunar Maria. And this is where you wanna maybe make a little tripod with your pinky. Try not to touch your background layer. And if you're having a hard time with that, then just hang out and wait for that background to be dry to do this part. But yeah, this is the sweet spot when it's nice and dry like this. Then you can really stipple it in. Little dots, one little dot at a time. Oh my goodness, a little drop of water come down off my paintbrush. Right as I was saying how I was at a sweet spot where I could really control everything I was doing. So, yeah, I'm just looking at the reference photo and where those really dark moments are showing up. And if it's too dry, like I'm like, dang, it kind of dried a little more than I wanted it to be, then you could maybe grab one of your medium washes and touch it with it so that it kind of bleeds it in a little. Or maybe you do one more layer with the medium wash and then touch that with the darkest wash. I mean, the darkest direct ink. It's, yeah, this is like so dry that it's like standing out a little too much. I feel like I maybe needed more of a transitional layer between these two. So I just added a little bit of a wash to spread that around and make it feel a little like ease that transition between that super dark and the medium dark. All right, 7:19. I'm gonna do this for 3 or 4 more minutes and then I'll do the last white stuff, even if I'm not finished here. So just got my reference photo in one hand and bouncing around all of these darkest values. And then after I put a little bit of them on, I'm grabbing that medium wash on my paintbrush and then bleeding that darkest dark into the Lunar Maria a little bit so that it fills it in. And then, yeah, now that this is dry, you can definitely see how that last layer I put on, it felt pretty dark, but then it dries so much lighter. So probably needed one more layer of medium dark before we did the direct ink details, but since we don't have time for it, I'm just doing it this way. But like I said, there's no rush for you to finish. And I feel like after I show you the little white, the last white stuff we're going to add to it, you'll have all the tools that you need to finish this on your own. You can take your time. So definitely don't rush any aspect of this. The more you build up these layers slowly, the more control you'll have over it, and the more you'll be able to have these variety of values too. Okay. Yeah, I love these moments where you go in between the little radiating lines that come out from the Tycho crater and put in these dark, absolute dark moments. That contrast is so fun. That really starts to make it feel like the moon. That is probably, for me, that's the most distinguishing characteristic of the moon is that Tycho crater and those strong, dark, organic, blobby shapes. As long as you've got that and it's hugging the three-dimensional contours of a sphere, you've got yourself a moon. And then as far as these like moments where I didn't quite like maintain the perfect circle on the outer edge of the moon, that's another thing that you could clean up. Well, I'll show you how we could clean it up with the white here in just a bit. Well, actually, I'll do it right now because I said I was going to give myself 3 more minutes. I'm like snoozing, hitting the snooze button on these values. Okay, so let me take my white here. And yeah, let's take a little bit of green, like from our direct ink, and let's mix it with some of our white to recreate that lightest wash that we made, this like minty green. And it may not match perfectly, so we might end up having to do this like all the way around. But since this white is so opaque, if we make a really light minty green with it, this will be the solve if you have some like weird edges, like that little moment where I messed up and went into it right there. See, I can just use that little minty green, and I might end up having to do like a whole nother layer if that doesn't match perfectly. Or you might. I feel like I camouflaged it pretty good right there. It's not too bad. But I could do that all the way around. This is, when people tell me, I can't believe you paint with ink as much as you do, it's so unforgiving. And I'm like, no way, man, it's the most forgiving. Look at this. We got white out, y'all. You can fix anything. So I think it's so forgiving because it's so opaque. And especially if you let those layers dry, I mean, you can really sculpt with it and you can fix a lot of things that might not. You can do a lot of things with it, I think, that you can't do with a lot of other mediums, and this is definitely one of those things. Okay, right there, it's looking a little pasted on, so I might just leave that alone. I could also go back with my dark green later and clean up that edge. So maybe, if you've done this all the way around and it still looks wonky, it might be the dark green that needs to get cleaned up, not the moon edge. Okay. Now for all those fun little white, I mean, they really feel like stars, all those craters that are just splattered all around. All right, here's my trick. So this is if you don't have the dexterity needed to do these little white pin pricks. You could use a white gel pen when this is totally dry, or you can do this trick. I'm tearing up my paper towel and making kind of a little circle edge with my paper towel. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's okay if it covers up part of the moon too. This is what I used to do before I got good at being able to control my paintbrush to make my little white pin pricks. And I think I've shown you all my star splatter trick before, but we've never done it with something that, you know, we don't want the stars to splatter on the background. So I know this looks a little crazy, but I'm just covering up that background for a second there. Okay, so now I'm gonna take my white, take my little liner brush, I'm gonna load it up. And then I'm just gonna hold the paintbrush in one hand and I'm gonna tap it with the other hand and get it to splatter like that. Okay. And then if you are good at the little pin pricks, then you can, you know, go around and do some little pin pricks. We can also turn some of these into little radiating craters. Because again, who's going to double check your moon and make sure that your moon is exactly like the picture? And if you want to be exact, then don't just splatter white everywhere. But if you don't care, then that's a fun way to get some of those on there in a way that's it's going to have a variety. Like some of them are going to splatter kind of thick and some of them are going to splatter thin. So you can get a variety of them to happen. Okay, and then we'll take away those paper towels. Oops, one of them went onto my background there. And do a little surgery. Okay, so if that happened to you, if it snuck underneath there, just get it a little wet and then just pull it out. It should, because the bottom, I mean, if your background's dry, it should just come right off. If your background is wet, then you might have a little weird moment you gotta fix later with your next layer of green. Okay, we went right up to the edge of the hour here. We might go a minute or two over, but I'm gonna go ahead and peel off my tape for that satisfying moment. So satisfying, y'all. And then if y'all can stick around for another minute, I'd love to see some of your examples. Yeah, you really can't tell what it looks like sometimes until you peel that tape off. And then even though I might want to do another layer on that background, I should be able to do it without, you know, going right up to the edge, because mostly you need, I mean, you could always retape it too, but I just want to see what it looks like. And there it is. It looks pretty cool. I do need to clean up a couple of little moments there, but not too shabby. I'd love to see some of y'all's examples. If you want to hold them up and we can spotlight you. All right, Sarah, that's so fun. I love how it feels very like an old school painting of the moon from the early 1900s. That's what it reminds me of. I love it. It's really great. Thank you. Right, and there's, ooh, Barbara went with a red moon, a pink moon with a red background. I love it. Like a blood moon. Yeah, yours has that same early, why am I blanking on the name of that film? It's one of my favorites to reference with the moon, but yeah, it really reminds me of that vintage moon there. All right. Oh, and there's Juan. Hey, Juan. Oh, that looks gorgeous. Oh, I love the blue. I almost wanted to do another blue moon. I've painted so many blue moons. It's my favorite color to paint a moon. Really nice. Geldy. Lovely. Oh, I love how your background, how the bleed happened. That looks really nice. It's got like a, feels like the aurora borealis back there. I had such FOMO this week, missing out on seeing those northern lights. I hope y'all get to see them. Some of you did. That's lovely. Thank you, Geldy. Right, this is Mata. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love how thin and washy everything is. And it's feeling really spherical. You're getting those, everything to follow those contours really nicely. Thank you for sharing. Okay. Yeah, we're a small group here at the end. Okay, well, thank you all so much. And yeah, we've got 2 Wednesdays off since May is so has so many Wednesdays, and then we'll be back in June for the eyes and the strawberries. All right, and make sure you sign up for my online draw club. I forgot to mention that, but if you want to draw with me before June, again on Saturday mornings, I'm doing this online draw club, and you can sign up through the link in my bio, my link tree on my Instagram, and join me for that. All right, thanks y'all. Have a great rest of May.